Leticia Nogueira, PhD, MPH, is the Senior Principal Scientist at the Surveillance and Health Equity Science Department at the American Cancer Society. Go ahead, Leticia, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Climate change is the greatest threat to human health of our time. If when you hear this, you think about future predictions of rising sea levels or increased incidence of vector-borne diseases in faraway countries, think again. Climate change is already impacting the health of individuals across the world. This is happening right now in all countries. Climate change alters the frequency and behavior of extreme weather events. Warmer air holds more water vapor, which increases the water capacity of hurricanes. We can see this with Hurricane Harvey. This is a map from NOAA showing rainfall over Houston during Hurricane Harvey. And NOAA had to create new colors and add them to the legend because it had never rained so much in one spot before. And this is a problem because side by side with the map from NOAA is a map showing the concentration of carcinogens released from industrial pollution in the Houston area. And climate change, Hurricane Harvey's unprecedented precipitation, which climate change made 3.5 times more likely to happen, flooded chemical plants, oil refineries, and Superfund sites that contained vast amount of carcinogens, which were released into the Houston community. And I want to pause here and ask, where are these carcinogens coming from? Our reliance on fossil fuels is a shared cause of climate change and the rising exposure to carcinogens. When you start thinking like this, one of the first things that might come to mind is lung cancer and air pollution from vehicle emissions. The same air pollution that is driving the greenhouse effect also increases lung cancer risk. However, extracting, processing, transporting, and waste management of fossil fuels releases many carcinogens in the environment before and after they are consumed. Take fracking, which is used to extract natural gas, for example. Piped natural gas must continuously be repressurized at compressor stations, which emit methane, fine particulate matter, benzene, formaldehyde, and other non-human carcinogens. Then there's the waste that flows back up a fracked well. This material also contains carcinogens and is often hauled by trucks to sites called injection wells. And the carcinogens dumped in these injection wells can contaminate water sources. Fracking wells are prevalent worldwide and pose risk of water contaminations to communities across the globe. After extraction, there is processing in refineries, which also release carcinogens in the communities, as we saw in Houston. Then there is transportation, which can also release carcinogens, especially when spills happen. Then consumption, which you're probably most familiar with. And then waste, which we don't usually think about. And we talked about fracking waste being injected in wells, but sometimes it is also stored in tanks or in pits, which can leak. And my favorite, used in irrigation. So each step that's part of our reliance on fossil fuels is contributing to climate change and also increasing exposure to carcinogens in the population. And there's another pathway through which climate change impacts cancer that we heard a little bit already today. And that is through disruptions in access to care. Harvey didn't flood just the Houston industrial complex. He also flooded healthcare facilities, including several large cancer centers in Houston. And it wasn't the first time Houston had been impacted by a hurricane. The hospitals thought they were prepared. They all had backup generators, but Harvey was different. It stalled over Houston, then it rained, then it flooded, then the backup generators flooded. Extreme weather events can damage medical infrastructure, break transportation links, and disrupt supply chains, and interfere with cancer care even when they strike far from where cancer is being delivered. We have previously conducted a study looking at the impact of hurricanes on cancer patients, and we found that individuals whose facility was impacted by a hurricane during their radiation treatment had worse overall survival than those who completed treatment in the same facility, but in the absence of a disaster. Not only that, but the longer the disaster declaration lasted, which can be taken as a proxy for how big of an impact the hurricane had on the community, the worse the overall survival. And sometimes people ask, well, yeah, but how many people are really impacted by a hurricane? So this map is showing healthcare facilities that were impacted by a hurricane during a 5-year period. And of course, these are highly populated areas. It's some of the largest cancer centers in the United States. So many patients are impacted, and we're estimating that about 63% of facilities are impacted by a hurricane every 5 years. Several other nations, as we heard already today, are also impacted by hurricanes and also suffer the detrimental consequences associated with infrastructure damage and disruptions in access to care. Although we don't have the data necessary to estimate the number of healthcare facilities or patients that are impacted. And these nations might have fewer resources to build resilience against climate-driven disasters. Because hurricanes are just one type of extreme weather event. If we include other types of extreme weather events, then 99% of healthcare facilities in the US were impacted by a climate-driven disaster in a 5-year period. So what do we do? There are several steps individuals, institutions, and policymakers can take to better prepare for climate-driven disasters. We recently evaluated the type of disaster preparedness information that is available in cancer centers' websites, because these are distributed nationwide and they're a trusted source of information in their communities. The first thing that we notice is that most websites provide some information about the COVID-19 pandemic, which was declared a national disaster in March of 2020. Fewer centers provided information on climate-driven disasters, which has been impacting healthcare facilities since before March of 2020. The majority of centers that provided any information had information on steps that individuals can take for COVID and for climate, including creating a portable medical card or pre-registering for special needs shelters. But I would argue that putting the burden on the individual to prepare for a disaster might not be the best strategy. To be fair, some websites also provided steps information were taken for COVID and for climate disasters, including consolidating appointments to minimize time spent outdoors during wildfires. So there's an opportunity here for better information sharing about experiences developing and implementing disaster preparedness plans, so we can continuously improve our adaptation efforts. For example, the changes in radiation therapy schedules that were implemented during the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico were then adopted during the lockdown phase of the pandemic. Cancer centers will usually have greater access to resources and have established collaborations with other healthcare facilities are well positioned to become knowledge hubs for our adaptation efforts. And because cancer is not one disease, it's several diseases, each of which with associated comorbidities, information sharing by oncology professionals can also inform adaptation efforts for other medically vulnerable populations. Because beyond disruptions in access to care, individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer are a vulnerable population to the health hazards of climate change due to the physical, psychological, and socioeconomic consequences of cancer diagnosis and treatment. The physical and psychological consequences listed here, for example, lead to increased sensitivity to the health hazards of climate change. Some cancer treatment drugs can inhibit thermal regulation, making individuals diagnosed with cancer more vulnerable to heat waves. A weakened immune system can make individuals more vulnerable to infections, which are more common during flooding events. Cancer diagnosis and treatment also has socioeconomic consequences. Expenses that arise during cancer treatment and survivorship care, combined with the changes in the ability of individuals diagnosed with cancer to remain employed during and after cancer treatment, are some of the ways cancer diagnosis is associated with increased financial hardship. And these socioeconomic consequences make it harder for individuals diagnosed with cancer to prepare and respond to disasters. It impacts their ability to stockpile food, or to evacuate, or to adapt their housing infrastructure to cope with extreme weather events, such as improving insulation or using air conditioning during a heat wave, or installing special air filters during wildfires. And people are more than their cancer diagnosis. Different individuals' characteristics, including our racial and gender identity, the languages we speak, our socioeconomic status, all impact our vulnerability to the health hazards of climate change. Because there are no natural disasters. Disasters are the result of social constructs, economic models, and political choices that determine our exposure, our human contact with environmental hazards, and our vulnerability to these hazards. I would like to borrow the example used by Malcolm Ferdinand here in his book, The Colonial Ecology. The cover of the book displays the painting by William Turner, inspired by the true story of the slave ship Zong. The departure of a slave ship required substantial initial capital, so stakeholders took out insurance. During Zong's journey, after a series of navigational errors that increased the journey time, crew members decided it would be more profitable to throw enslaved individuals, still in chains, overboard. and file for insurance compensation, claiming the enslaved individuals died as a result of an exceptional event, an approaching storm. However, the enslaved individuals were thrown overboard before the storm arrived, and this is what is centered in the painting and in the book. The storm is not the starting point of the disaster. The action of throwing people overboard to prioritize profits is the starting point. Disasters are not caused by environmental hazards. Disasters are caused by human action. Colonialism used violence to create hierarchical racial categorizations and power dynamics and establish the dominance of imperial powers over colonies through extraction, displacement, degradation, and impoverishment. The colonial matrix of power persists to this day, with historically exploited economies now being called developed countries, often with similar structures of domination over former colonies or poor countries, with tax breaks and subsidies offered to extractive industries and loans or aids offered to former colonies. This structure perpetuates environmental degradation and destroys food and other forms of sovereignty, leading to poverty, vulnerability, and dependency, which decrease the adaptive capacity of these nations. We can also see how colonial mentality of homogeneity and dominance still acts to maintain the power structure established more recently with the Green Revolution. During the Cold War, food security emerged as a political issue. Intellectuals warning that hungry people were more vulnerable to communism and urged the deployment of efforts to increase agricultural yield in poor countries. Similar to the colonial mentality that characterized occupied territories as unproductive and in need of civilizing forces, the Green Revolution completely ignored existing regenerative food systems and encouraged planting monocultural blocks of annual grains using hybrid seeds that needed to be repurchased every year and only achieved predicted yields with heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides, a more profitable business model that also fostered reliance on government assistance and therefore political loyalty. The premise of the Green Revolution was to save people from starvation. But with the establishment of a system that required purchase of inputs, the Green Revolution pushed the small farmers out of their livelihood and into debt, leading to loss of their farmland, as well as loss of knowledge of how to interact with these diverse ecosystems in a sustainable way. An example of how even well-intended policies created with a colonial mentality can have detrimental consequences. Now, with increased interest in regenerative agriculture, we are learning that traditional forms of polyculture and natural resource management actually have higher yields and are better able to sustain plant and soil biodiversity without the need of external inputs. However, the oppressive structures that led to the systematic devastation of these healthy and sustainable ways of life led to the increased prevalence of chronic health conditions, which increase sensitivity to environmental hazards, and uneven resource distribution, which decreases the adaptive capacity of these countries. So I hope that the next time you see a map of vulnerability to the health hazards of climate change, you think about the economic and political structures that are determining the conditions imposed on individuals in these communities. That we remember what came first. While it's true that communities targeted for marginalization suffer first and worse from the health threats of climate change, nobody is safe. I believe you're familiar with recent climate-driven extreme weather events in Europe, for example. And it's exactly because communities targeted for marginalization suffer first and most that we need to include these neglected voices in the conversation. Nurses know this better than anyone. A lot of times when you're closer to the problem, you're closer to the solution. And I wanted to give at least one solution that can be applied by people in this audience. The healthcare system is an extremely energy-intensive industry. If reducing energy consumption at your home is beneficial, imagine what reducing energy use or changing the energy source at your institution would do. Increasing use of clean energy sources, especially those generated on-site, can reduce the carbon footprint of institutions and also make them more resilient to power outages that are only expected to become more frequent with climate change. The healthcare system also purchases significant amounts of food and can decrease its environmental impact by seeking environmentally responsible food manufacture, shipment, and waste options. Meat from ruminants has the highest environmental impact, no matter how you measure it. And if you consider the emissions associated with the production, processing, and transportation of feed, the methane emissions by the ruminants, energy consumption at the feedlots, the amount of antibiotics and pesticides used, and the amount of waste generated, then it's easy to understand why the environmental impact of meat production is so significant. And it's also a carcinogen. There are several other steps that health institutions can take to decrease the environmental impacts. And if you're looking at this list and thinking, this lady's crazy, there's no way my institution would do any of that. Let me ask you something. Are you allowed to smoke on campus? How do you think that happened? How do you think it started? If you're attending this talk, you most certainly have the power to make a difference. Recognize where your leverage points are. Use your leverage. Move the world. Thank you.
Wow, Leticia, that was an amazing presentation. I think all of us would like to listen to you for longer because this was so inspiring, so good. Thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you have time to stay for a little bit longer, as the next two speakers are going to speak about climate change as well. So maybe actually we can do a debate of 3 instead of 2. So let's see if you can stay a little bit longer because this was really, really good. There is a question saying that if the US can learn from other countries as well as vice versa with information sharing.
Yes, of course. And I would love to see more of that happen. You know, like I said, the solutions are coming from different ways of thinking. If we're only thinking about the US as, you know, what which is parachute medicine or parachute solutions are coming and can come from anywhere. And I think that the more we share information about adaptation and mitigation strategies, the better off we will all be.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for your amazing presentation.